Welcome, Wargamers, to the third installment of my coverage on the Animosity Campaign Prime Dominion, where players all over the world are contributing hobby progress, games, art, and so on to feed a massive collaborative storytelling event. Now, if you want to learn more about Animosity, I've left a link in the description down below to a playlist with everything that I've done this year for them, and there is like a basic explanation of what it is. And there's still 2 weeks left to jump in if you don't want to miss out this year. And of course, going into this video, I will assume you've watched the other ones and you're just kind of catching up. And so, with all that out of the way, let's jump right in to round 3. Like last time, every faction is essentially presented 2 situations involving other factions. How they choose to resolve them becomes harder and harder over time. We are seeing allies twist, enemies reveal themselves, and all manner of wackiness popping up from the part of the game masters who are kind of coordinating all these things, and I am loving it. Now, I've started the last 2 weeks with talking about the Satrapy of Dreams, Celen deck, and I see no reason to stop because, quite frankly, I've got good news, everyone. Before that, though, one quick correction. Last week, when the Celen deck took the Fount of Aqua Guaranis from my people, the Dornyar, I said it was settled with an honor duel, and I was mistaken. I must have misread my notes. My apologies and thank you to everyone who pointed it out. It was actually stolen and taken by force, and I joked that the smallest, quote-unquote, of the satraps seemed to be picking a whole lot of fights. They had the invasion of Teklund deck in round 1, now this in week 2, there's just a lot going on. But consequences are a very hard thing to outrun, and consequences are, in my opinion, the theme of Celen deck's week. You see, the Teklund deck didn't really ever get over the invasion of Wirinth from round 1. Remember, they sent a kind of token skirmishing force to chase down the Celen deck invaders, and that skirmishing force was ultimately wiped out. But the reason that their assets and their attention was centered elsewhere was because the Teklund deck were busy retrieving a massive super weapon known only as the Geode, which they acquired in week 2. So now, Teklund deck is ready for vengeance, it has the Geode, and is turning its gaze back to Celen deck. So in the time of that great, Geode heist, the Celen deck leaders figured that some form of retribution was inevitably going to come. There's no way they would only send skirmishers when we fully invaded a whole chunk of their land, especially after we, brutally killed the skirmishers too. So the Celen deck retreated to the island of Arasni and waited there and fortified it. Now the Teklund deck have a shiny new weapon and one heck of a grudge, but they didn't want to be reckless about their assault. Lord Imperator Kongming was in charge of the Teklund deck assault, and he came up with a clever plan. A 3-pronged attack from land, air, and subterranean forces. See, the initial land army would assault the Celen deck defenses head-on, and then kind of like feign and make a show of falling back, acting totally beaten. When the Celen deck gave chase from their defenses, the second arm would come from the sky and assault the now exposed defenders, the Celen deck who were chasing them, at the same time that the subterranean force, who have been burrowing underneath the defenses, would burst upward and take out any of the Celen deck army who didn't give chase after that initial ground army, and that way you're pulling the defenses apart. You pull the army out of the tower, you siege the tower, and you destroy the army when it's no longer in it. Now, this grand plan, unfortunately, did not work out so perfectly. They used the power of the Geode to great effect, blasting the Celen deck defenders with intense light of hish, so much so that they were blinded, like no wall or closed eye was powerful enough to stop this beam of light. And so it immediately sent the defenders into a form of panic. The ground forces landed of the Teklund deck, but the problem is, the entire plan hinged upon the ground forces going and causing a ruckus and pulling the defending army out of their tower. Well, when they landed, they walked up, and the attacking army, the Teklund deck, found that Sylvaneth had kind of weaved thick woods, and other defenders have created these natural defenses around the tower itself. And so it created this incredibly treacherous perimeter. So the main land army didn't quite get the attack off that they wanted. However, the other attacking formations did succeed for the most part. A siege army burrowed up from underground at the same time as the air kind of strike force came down and was harassing the defenders from on high. And between the two of them, this snapping jaw, the Celen army was humbled. Their defense tower crumbled, many of their fighters dead, with a few escaping through a breach in the wall, and then there was this rear guard of Celen that was posted to make sure as many people could get out as possible, and they were all taken prisoner. That rear guard, that is. And the Teklund rejoiced in their victory. I'm going to go ahead and call this a minor victory, just because, they didn't have the plan didn't go perfectly. They took more losses than maybe they intended to, but ultimately it was a fantastic strike back at the Celen and use of the geode. But what else have the Teklund been up to? Like I said, every satrap has 2 story elements to track, and their second involves the R&R. Well, their relationship was put on a knife's edge by the actions of one Darius, nephew of Dariel, who was the leader of the Teklund. He was caught delving deep into enemy territory in a desperate hunt for that satrap's vaults. Basically, he was trying to find where do they keep their weapons, where do they keep their riches. He was killing guards, at least a few of them on the way in. And so the R&R caught him snooping around, and it brings up a complicated situation. Because they didn't want to just outright kill the nephew of another, faction leader. That would spark an entirely new war front, and it would not be good for anybody. And so the diplomats from Teklund and R&R came together for a chat, and they reached a very clever solution. Darius would remain a political prisoner of the R&R. He simply knew too much about the vaults and what they contained to be released back home. However, when the civil war ends, he will be returned once the intel is meaningless, right? Once we're all on the same team and we have a leader and things are chill, no one really cares if he knows where the vaults are, but right now it's just a little bit too tumultuous. However, the other side of the deal is that he's not going to be kept in a dungeon. He's going to be respected, given a set of Teklund bodyguards, and given a job as a ledger keeper. And in this way, both factions agreed to let the incident pass and resolved the conflict with diplomacy rather than war. And this is actually something I want to touch on because someone left a comment on one of my videos and they're like, how come you talk about the ones that don't have a battle associated with them? Why do you talk about these little ones where the teams just kind of go, okay, let's just, fist bump and get over it? The idea being, it sounds a little anticlimactic because the factions talked it out rather than battling. But honestly, this is the best part of what Animosity can bring, and that is role-playing. The representatives from each faction, chosen by players from around the world, came together for a solution. And while it may not contain a lot of action, this is a perfect example of storytellers working together. And I'll try to highlight that again and again when I do these videos, because to me, it's not that they lack drama or action, it just doesn't involve swords. Now, that story is the first half of the R&R as well, so what else have they been up to? Well, they've still been involved in a back-and-forth feud with my home satrapy of the Dorniar. It all started with the Eye of Noctis in Week 1. A powerful artifact was found, and both sides were rushing to take it. R&R got it first in the first week. Then in Week 2, the Dorniar blew the ship transporting it, the Golden Eagle, out of the sky, and the wreck was surrounded, and the Dorniar were there, but trapped behind enemy lines. Now, this specific story or interaction, has a ton of back and forth, with epic appearances from tons of players. You really get the sense that both teams put a lot into this, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a fantastic narrative. The full written account of it, I'll leave a link to in the description down below. But it's so much to cover that I just kind of want to focus on the highlights. The ship crashed with the Eye of Noctis in it, but the crew and the soldiers aboard, they didn't all die. And so they formed as good a defense within the ship in its hold as possible. The Dorniar were battered and beaten as well, while reinforcements from both sides flocked to this site. And as those reinforcements arrived, the battle would ebb and flow with whoever got refreshed the most recently. So, like, the Dornyar would arrive, and all of a sudden they would be winning, and then more Arnar would arrive, and they'd be winning. Some reinforcements came from the nearby Arnar artifact vault, where the ship was headed. Oh no, but some of the Dornyar snuck in there and looted the place. It's just this constant back and forth between these two factions. Until finally, the Arnar had no choice but to play their ace in the hole. If you remember from last week, they secured exactly one favor from a Draconith that they freed in the woods. A dragon was trapped and they freed it, and it was like, hey, here's your get out of jail free card, hands it over. And so they cashed that card in, and he descended into the battle and wrecked the Dornyar's day. With plot armor, thick scales, and a gout of pure MacGuffin flames pouring out from his mouth, he slew the Dornyar army. And I joke, but it's really actually quite significant that they used their one-time use calling of this dragon. That was them going absolutely all in when Dornyar was also going all in. But because of that event, the Dornyar were routed. They took a few goods from the vault, but the Eye of Noctis was firmly taken by the Arnar. And while the Dornyar were defeated here, they also did get a consolation prize in the form of their second story, which involves the Idrilik. For context, the Idrilik were long ago attacked by a Death Knight called Artaxerxes. Basically, he was like a Death Knight who was just kind of in the area, and the Idrilik slayed him in battle. However, this Death Army has risen again thanks to a curious enchanted ring that the Death Knight wears. And the Idrilik and the Dornyar both heard about this at the same time, and both factions want that ring. You know, who doesn't want the power to become truly deathless? But the problem is, both the factions involved, the Idrilik and the Dornyar, have their armies tied up elsewhere. The Dornyar are trying to get the Eye of Noctis. The Idrilik are busy. That's my next story I'm going to talk about, so we'll get there in a second. And so the leaders of these satrapies met to chat about a plan and came up with this. The Idrilik could go out and kill the Death Lord as punishment for his actions long ago. You know, they're the satrapy of like valor and honor and martial combat. They want to slay the guy. Makes total sense. The Dornyar want to take the ring to study its magics. They are the satrapy of learning and knowledge and that kind of stuff. Information, if nothing else. At which point, after research, the ring would be returned to the Idrilik. And that's essentially what happened. The Death Knight was killed, and in the process, he revealed that he worked for Mithridates Alti, who was the vampire character who seems to be more and more of a puppet master of the Prime Dominion. The ring was taken, it was given to Dornyar to study, but before they gave it over, it was enchanted further with a curse that if the Dornyar didn't return it by a set time, a demon would pop out and slaughter them all. This was to ensure that the Dornyar didn't, quote-unquote, hold it temporarily, indefinitely, which, of course, we planned to do. But this was a diplomatic win, and a win for the continued teamwork of Dornyar and Idrilik, and uncovered just a hint more about what's going on in the Prime Dominion. Because if Alti is back and he's playing a game, how is he using this civil war to his advantage? We'll come back to that story beat in a second. Now, the second story beat for the Idrilik is sort of a somber one, and it concerns their rivalry with the Ruular. To do a very quick sum up, Vashti is the name of a royal who was once part of the Idrilik that defected to marry the leader of the Ruular. That wedding was interrupted by an Idrilik army that took Vashti away in chains, basically calling her a traitor. You defected, you're going to share secrets, state secrets, that kind of thing. And they gave Vashti a chance to fight for her life in, noble combat in a coliseum. The Ruular, a bit upset about their queen-to-be being stolen away, invaded and the two nations clashed. In the aftermath, Vashti was dead, and neither side had really won the fight, and the carnage dissipated as Ruular forces fell back. Oddly enough, the body of Vashti went mysteriously missing. Well, after several small skirmishes here and there of warlords getting their own personal vendettas out of the way, the two satrapies came together for a meeting to truly discuss where to go from here. There's a lot of bad blood, it's a political situation that's hard to resolve, and ultimately they agreed to a ceasefire and would together hold a memorial service for Vashti. As it became clear, she was massively beloved and important to both factions. They came together, grieved, and seemed to have resolved this matter for now. Their leaders still want nothing to do with one another, hate still bubbles to the surface, but at this point, there's nothing to be gained by their fight. Vashti's dead, her body was lost, each side thinks the other secretly has it, and there is only grief and rage left, neither of which can be satiated with any amount of battle. And that's a diplomatic win for both sides, and I actually like it a lot, right? Because, this one story of Vashti has really defined these two factions. And so with that put to bed, I'm interested to see where they go from here. I still think the Ruular are some of the best heroes of the campaign because they were stalwart and threw half their army to defend the Prime Dominion in the first week, so they still have a lot of positive energy from me personally. And I thoroughly enjoyed the story here. It's this political intrigue boiling over to the extreme. And of course, that story makes up the first part of the Ruular side of things, but they have been up to a bit more as well. Because coming back full circle, they have an interaction with the Celen deck, so we'll tackle the second story for both of those factions. You see, long ago, the last time the satrapies warred against one another, a leader of the Ruular bore a weapon known as the Spear of Selenar. This was lost to time in the course of those wars. Well, it was recently unearthed, and the Ruular want it badly, as you would expect. It's an artifact of their people, a part of their heritage, their birthright, all these kinds of things. But the problem is it lies in a ruin deep within Celen deck territory. And what's more, all the spying and the information gathering has tipped off the Celen deck. So the two satrapies open a dialogue about it. Neither wants yet another war front. The Celen deck are having a bad week. So are the Ruular. So they agreed to basically make a spectacle of it. And they held little contests of champions amongst themselves for the right to claim the spear. And in the end, the Celen deck champion named Sigmund Moritz the Unlucky took the spear home. And I kind of like that. I like when there's, a resolution to an isolated conflict. It doesn't have to boil over into a massive, epic, multi-week war or anything like that. It's just, hey, we tried to get this thing. I kept this thing. That's it. Now, that's not all the factions have been up to, because even though each satrap or faction is given two narrative leads to deal with, there are events going on in the Prime Dominion that involve everybody. There are still these elements of politicking, and that everyone needs to participate, because remember, everyone, even though they're fighting amongst each other, is still trying to win the hearts of the people, to assert themselves as the obvious choice for leader of the Prime Dominion. Last week, there was a Trial of Champions, little gladiatorial thing, and this week there is the Winter Ball of Iscarion. Now, let me read this event description here. The heart of Iscarion culture is the Winter Ball. Each year, the nobles and worthies of Iscarion and each satrapy gather to celebrate together the renewal of the year and the salvation of the Iscarnelth in the Prime Dominion. Even in times of war, this tradition had been carried on, a chance for at least a single night to put aside all enmity and embrace the civilized values. This year, even the mercenaries were invited, who were reminded that violence is not permitted in Iscarion, and that their conduct would be reflected upon their satrapy's reputation. Those present would be able to pose one request to the Sibyl of Dawn, a boon, a material or information for services rendered to the Prime Dominion. Now, many players attended the ball. Some of them had subterfuge in their minds. This was a bit of a time for the role-playing stuff to get a little fun, a little wacky. Of course, we're halfway through the campaign, and so it's just time to kind of be chill, diffuse things, and relax. So there's a lot of fun stories about orcs and ogres hitting the dance floor. All kinds of mercenary beer brewers were all brought in to cater the event, that kind of stuff. It was just a fun thing for all the factions to participate in. The most notable presence at the ball was definitely the guests from the Idrilik, which will ensure that their interests are served well by the nobility and influential people of Iscarion. So that's kind of like a soft, political win for the Idrilik here. They were the best hosts, the best guests, and everything like that. But unfortunately, this party was interrupted, because the kind of meta events surrounding the Prime Dominion reared their ugly heads. So we're going to pause here and kind of talk about what's been going on in the background. Mithridates Alti is a vampire lord who has been pulling the strings of things for some time. He was one of the few who initially led this group of elven refugees to the Prime Dominion. He twisted and corrupted their last leader, the one who, when he was deposed of power, sparked this entire civil war. And they thought they got Alti, but he was still around. And he's been popping up here and there, kind of between story beats for the last 2 weeks, even going so far as to appear in the battle between the Ruular and the Idrilik, and he actually took the body of Vashti. Again, both factions think the other have her, but actually, she was raised from the dead by Alti. And this is where he sets forth his grand plan to take control of the Prime Dominion. Now, there is an incredible story about this. If you go over to the link in the description below to the Animosity website where they write their full lore breakdown, it's written just like it was pulled out of a Games Workshop book. It is incredible. Please go read the whole thing. But in short, this week kind of leaves us on a bit of a cliffhanger because Mithridates Alti, the vampire lord, and Vashti, his now servant, raise up a castle from one of the floating island, not floating islands, but from the earth of one of the parts of the Prime Dominion. And it's got these like huge chains that are dragging behind it. So as this castle that's kind of floating, lurching, I guess, probably a better word, through the sky, it's headed towards Iscarion, and as these chains behind it are dragging on the land, it's like opening huge fissures, destroying villages and stuff. It's so cool. This castle is known as Castle Iskar. And so he brings this thing up from the ground, almost like if you're familiar with Prince Vordry, where he has a teleporting castle that kind of just flows, through time and space. This is a castle that was like in the ground. It rose up from being buried and is now sort of meandering towards Iscarion, the city's capital, sort of neutral ground. And so it absolutely interrupts the winter ball that's going on. And like I said, we're left on a bit of a cliffhanger because now the castle is above the actual capital of the Prime Dominion. Everyone's fleeing and panicking, and that is the setup for turn 4. So why is all of this so cool? Again, I cannot emphasize enough, I have super condensed a lot of things. Like, there are so many cool story elements. This is probably one of the best weeks of the Animosity campaign that I've seen, where factions are trying to create allies, things get twisted, the Ruular and the Idrilik have their thing, but we've put the whole story with Vashti to bed just in time for her to reappear, reanimated as undead, and all these things are falling apart. And as all of this civil war is happening, suddenly a threat that affects every single one of them shows up literally on their doorstep above their heads. So I'm curious as to what this means for those tiny squabbles that the satrapies have individually. Is everyone going to get it together and work together? Or, everyone's still trying to assert themselves as the rightful heir. And so what does that mean when there is a clear and present threat from a singular outside source? I'm so excited to learn about it. I want to see how this story concludes. I have no idea. Like I said, the characters are creating the narrative as we go, and so I don't know what the GMs have planned, and I am so excited to follow along. So I hope you do with me, and I hope you've enjoyed these videos. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.